I am an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and in the Department of Mechanical Engineering by courtesy at the University of Michigan. And I do a lot of research trying to understand the cultural mechanisms of inequality reproduction within STEM. And what I mean by that is the way that subtle beliefs and practices within the STEM community can lead to the entrenchment and reproduction of a lot of the processes of disadvantage that we know exist. And gender and motherhood biases are certainly a few of those. I want to acknowledge first and foremost the support of the National Science Foundation for much of the work I'll be talking about today, and much of the research I'll be speaking about is also in collaboration with Professor Mary Blair Loy at UC San Diego. Isabel very generously mentioned the recent study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. This is an open access article, so you're welcome to take a look at it and pass it around. There's a QR code there that will link to my website, which has a link to the article in turn. And so if you are interested in some of the specifics of the empirical work I'll be talking about today, or the methodology, or the specific analyses, I'll certainly direct you to that paper, and I'm happy to answer any questions around it in the Q&A. Okay, so what I'm going to be focused on today is first to talk about the issue of the potential for the gendered price of parenthood in STEM. And by price, I mean the kinds of consequences of parenthood on the career trajectories of persons in STEM. So I'll walk through some of the major findings from that Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences paper on the career trajectories of new parents in STEM. And then talk about some brand new findings about the diversion of new parents out of the most prestigious, the most elite types of work in STEM, even when they remain employed in STEM full time. Then I'll discuss some of the catalysts for these kinds of patterns. So not only structural processes, so things like paid leave or opportunities for part-time and ramp-up trajectories, but also the cultural catalyst. So the meaning making, the biases and things that amplify and reproduce these sorts of patterns. And then articulate some considerations for change. And I think this will be a very nice lead into Leah's presentation, which I think is a little bit more specific in the latter two of these considerations. Okay, so if you have made it this far in this conference, it is not a surprise to you that in the labor force generally, and in the U.S. in particular, women are underrepresented in industry as well as in academia. So currently, women make up about 21% of STEM industry professionals, but much less than that among managers. So only 15% of managers in STEM in the United States are women, and only 6% of managers in engineering are women. In academia, we know that there's an overrepresentation of women in the temporary adjunct to lectureship positions. So women make up 36% of adjunct track faculty, but only 28% of tenure track and 16% of full professors. And in the US, currently only about 9% of engineering faculty are women. We also know that there are issues around parenthood in academia. So compared to a man with a child, a woman with a child who is seeking a tenure track position is about 24% less likely to attain a tenure track position than an equal qualified man with a child. And mothers are about 30% less likely to achieve tenure when they have children compared to men with children who are equally qualified and experienced. So these issues around parenthood are heavily gendered, but they also have a valence of the gendering of the parenthood and the care responsibilities on top of them. So what my research looks at in this space is, does parenthood help us understand some of the gendered patterns that have been so difficult to change over the last 40 or 50 years? So what is the role of parenthood in the kinds of gendered career trajectories that we see in STEM? And so, in order for me to kind of articulate where I'm coming from with this, I think it's important to note a couple of things. So, first and foremost, is that when we think about underrepresentation of particular groups within STEM, we need to not think about it as a snapshot. So, what is the picture like in 2021 in terms of representation, sort of in K-12 and higher education, et cetera, but rather adopt what's called a life course perspective, meaning that we want to focus on what are the trajectories of people over their career and their life course that might be differentially impacted by structures of gender and parenthood and the like. So in this perspective, we want to think about how gendered expectations and constraints impact both career and family trajectories over the life course to end up producing the kinds of patterns that I'll talk about in a moment. And what's so interesting about STEM in particular? So, as a sociologist, I'm really interested in broad patterns of inequality in the labor force. But the thing that interests me about STEM is that if you sort of flew into the labor force and knew nothing else about what's going on and looked at some of the features of the STEM workforce, you might think that STEM is a pretty good space in which to become a parent for those who wish to. Because, for example, STEM professionals often enjoy some freedom in the place that they work and the time that they work. So they might be able to flex some of the time that they're working into nights and weekends to accommodate other responsibilities in their life. They might be able to work from home a little bit more readily than people who might be bound to their employment space a little bit more. But they also are on the upper end of the income distribution, and so they can purchase assistance on the market. So they can purchase additional support in the form of additional childcare or someone to help with the cleaning or the meal preparation or things like that, in a way that professionals that might be on the lower end of the income spectrum might not be able to have that. So the question really is, why is STEM so challenging for people who have children? And so what research has found in the past is through surveys and through interview-based work, is that people who have children in STEM, particularly mothers, find it especially difficult to balance the demands of a STEM career with caregiving responsibilities. And as we'll talk about, that has to do with the combination of the expectations for what it means to be an ideal scientist or an ideal engineer, and also the expectations for what it means to be an ideal parent, especially an ideal mother. And when you have the combination, this sort of clash of those two expectations, it can be particularly difficult to figure out how to navigate and do so in a way that feels like one is solving the difficulties of that balance in an effective way. So what I want to ask with the first set of analyses are the following. So how do new parents fare in STEM? So what happens when childless STEM professionals have their first child? Do they stay in STEM full time? Do they leave STEM for another line of employment? Do they leave the labor force entirely? What happens to them? And particularly, to what extent is this a gendered pattern? So the second question is, does parenthood amplify the underrepresentation of women in STEM? But might this also have implications for fathers in a way that we want to think about this being something that is not necessarily only an issue for mothers, but rather a parenthood issue more broadly? And finally, if new parents leave STEM, where do they go? And what does that tell us about the ability for STEM to retain the kind of talent that they have already embedded within the STEM workforce? So the results that I present to you today are based on nationally representative longitudinal data that was collected by the United States National Science Foundation. So these are called CSTAT data, and the most recent wave of these CSTAT data are from 2003 to 2010. And what we do is we look at people who were initially childless in the first wave of the survey and follow them over the 7 to 8 year period to say, what happened to those who had children and what happened to their career trajectories down the line? And so the sample includes about 4,200 STEM professionals who were childless at that first point, and then about 841 of them who had a child between the first and the second survey waves, between 2003 and 2006. So essentially, this is a graph that represents a little bit more clearly what we're looking at here. So again, this is the 2003 to 2010 time period. And so everybody in the sample is employed full-time in STEM in 2003 and don't have children. And then there's a subset of people who had their first child between 2003 and 2006. And then we see what happened to them in 2008 and 2010. Do they stay employed in STEM full-time? Do they switch out of STEM to another job that's also full-time? Do they switch to part-time work of some kind, or do they leave the labor force entirely? So the analyses that I utilize to present the results that I'll articulate today utilize descriptive and logistic regression models. I use replicate weights for these, and I'm not going to go into the details of these for now, but I'm certainly happy to answer questions about them in the Q&A. And all the analyses control for potentially conflating axes of difference. So it controls for race, ethnicity, for the STEM discipline in which people work, for age, for the sector that people are employed in. So whether they're in the university sector or industry or nonprofit, what the highest level of education the respondent has. And then importantly, it controls for whether the respondent has a partner at home that doesn't work, with the assumption that that partner could take on more of the childcare responsibilities than somebody who has a partner that works full time or doesn't have a partner at all. And then the final control is whether the respondent has a second child between 2003 and 2010. So this starts the study period. And I'll do a little bit digging into what happens with people who only had one child to see if the patterns are distinct for them. Okay, so what I'm presenting on this slide are two graphs that look at the trajectories of new fathers and new mothers. So new fathers are going to be the results that are on the left here. And so what I do is I look to see what happens again to those people who are employed full-time in STEM before they had a child, and what happens after they have their first child. So this is the graph that I just sort of unveiled for fathers. So new fathers, we have a decline in the proportion of fathers who remain employed in STEM full-time. So this, the kind of light blue color, the bottom, the biggest chunk of the graph represents people who stay employed in STEM full-time after they have their first child. And so by 2006, about 85% of these new fathers are still employed in STEM full-time. And then by 2010, it's about 77%. The biggest chunk of new fathers actually move into full-time work outside of STEM. So that's that kind of thicker bluish band or dark blue band on the top. So about 18% of new fathers end up moving out of STEM to work in some non-STEM job full-time. So the question is, does that hold for mothers? Is the pattern similar or different for new mothers? And as you can see, it's quite distinct. We see immediately the curves compared to new fathers for new mothers are quite different. So between the time in 2003 when they had no children to 2006 when they had their first child, we go from 100% employed full-time in STEM to 58%. And that is not a number that actually comes back up again. So by 2010, by the time their first child is around school age, only 57% of these new mothers are still employed in STEM full-time. So let me break down these numbers a little bit more specifically. Okay, so looking just at new fathers compared to new mothers, those who remain in STEM full-time after having children, over this 8-year period, 77% of new fathers did, but only 57% of new mothers remained employed in STEM full-time after their first child. By 2010, we see a huge gender difference in who switches to part-time work after having their first child. 2% of new fathers switch to part-time work, but 15% of new mothers switch to part-time work in STEM. And we'll talk about the meaning of part-time work in STEM and sort of difficulties that might lead to for new mothers in STEM in a moment. And then about 15% of new mothers leave the workforce entirely after having their first child, and only 3% of new fathers do. So one of the questions that people often ask in the context of these findings is, well, maybe that's driven by people having more than one child over the study period. Maybe that if we look at people who only have one child during that study period, maybe the employment in full-time STEM work actually bumps back up again after the child has gone through sort of infant and toddler stage and gone into school age. Maybe the representation of women actually goes up again into full-time STEM employment. We find that for new fathers, there's really none of that. So new fathers who had only one child during that first period don't really come back up into full-time STEM employment after their first child, and not new mothers either. So again, these are people who didn't have another child in the study period. And by 2010, their children are school aged. And we don't see an uptick in the proportion of women who go back to full-time STEM employment. And in fact, the biggest change here is actually an increase in the representation of women who are in part-time STEM work rather than in part-time, rather than in full-time work outside of STEM. So it doesn't appear that for people whose children get a little bit older, they actually go back into full-time STEM employment. One of the things that's really important to emphasize here is that although the attrition of new parents is higher for mothers than it is for fathers, this is really an issue of parenthood in STEM in general, not just a motherhood problem. So in these analyses, and I won't walk through the entire table here, but what I'm showing is a regression analysis that looks at people who stayed employed full time. And it asks, are new parents more likely than people who remained childless to leave full-time STEM work for full-time work elsewhere? And what I find is that new parents are statistically more likely to leave full-time employment in STEM for full-time employment outside of STEM. What this tells us is that this isn't a full-time employment issue. It's a full-time employment in STEM issue. That STEM is particularly hostile to new parents being able to balance family and work responsibilities compared to work outside of STEM. Okay, so I did do some analyses that looked at intersectional differences. I'll just sort of touch on these very briefly. So there were a few racial ethnic differences. So for example, Asian and Asian American new parents were more likely than white new parents to stay employed in STEM full time rather than leave STEM for part-time work or work outside of STEM. We also found that having a PhD had a retaining effect, so that the higher the education level a STEM professional had, the less likely they were to leave STEM when they had their first child. But this also could be seen as a selection effect in terms of who is moving on to getting a PhD to begin with. We interestingly did not find broad differences by STEM disciplines. So one of the things we were interested in is whether these patterns were mitigated in the STEM fields, maybe like the life sciences, that had a higher representation of women, and that just wasn't the case. We saw similar patterns of attrition to this extent across STEM disciplines. And so, what are the takeaways from this first set of findings? First and foremost, that parenthood amplifies the gendered underrepresentation in STEM. So, if we're talking about the representation of women, we can't really do so fully without understanding how it's interwoven with parenthood processes. And second of all, we find substantial attrition of new parents generally. So 43% of new mothers and 25% of new fathers leave full-time STEM jobs, and 34% of new mothers and 24% of new fathers leave STEM entirely after they have their first child. And as we saw with the graphs with just people who had one child, it doesn't look like there is a big swing back into STEM after children are a little bit older. And importantly, 1 in 10 new mothers in STEM switch to part-time work in STEM. There's really a dearth of research and focus on what it means to do part-time work in STEM and the quality and the opportunities available for people who switch to part-time work in STEM after having children. I anticipate being asked about this question, so I want to note this sort of in the forefront. What do we think are the implications of this in the COVID-19 context? So I suspect that the COVID context likely amplifies these trends. So due to things like the demands for working parents to manage caregiving and distance learning at home, and the profound gendering of who is doing that managing of the caregiving and the distance learning, I suspect that it means that there's more gender movement into part-time STEM work than there was before. I expect that there's more gender departure of STEM entirely for women in STEM than there might have been, even a couple of years earlier. I expect that it becomes even increasingly difficult for women and mothers to rotate back into full-time STEM employment if they have departed for part-time work as a result of COVID. And I expect that this is something that affects fathers' persistence as well. So the next question I want to ask is something a little bit more nuanced. So the prior set of analyses I just presented was about really broad scale, who is staying in STEM and who is not. But my colleagues and I expect that there's actually much more subtle, more nuanced sort of changes that can happen in the work of new parents, even when they stay employed in STEM full time. So one of the questions that my research asks is there gendered attrition of new parents from the most culturally valued work tasks in STEM? So in general, each profession has work tasks that are highly valued. They're most prestigious, most core work of the profession. And then there's work that is seen as more tangential. So a good example of this would be an engineer who works in industry, and they might be doing engineering design work, designing novel technologies. That's sort of seen as the most prestigious, most core work an engineer can do, as opposed to something like technical sales, which is seen as more peripheral, less culturally core work. And of course, people doing that core work are still doing engineering work when they're not engaged in this core work. But culturally, there's a difference in valuation, in what's valued in the context of these work tasks. So this research asks, are new mothers more likely to be shunted out of core STEM tasks? So in this case, things like basic research, design, and programming, and shunted into more peripheral work like technical sales or quality management and the like. And our research finds that yes, mothers are less likely than fathers to do core professional work tasks as part of their job, and new mothers, and so it was people who were childless and were already doing these core professional work tasks. New mothers are more likely than new fathers to stop doing those core work tasks after they have children. So let me show you this graphically. So the graph on the left-hand side represents the change in the proportion of new mothers and new fathers who were engaged in these core work activities in some portion of their job, some corner of their work, at least 10% of their week to week work tasks were these core activities. And what I find is that there's a significant decline of new mothers' engagement in these core work activities compared to new fathers. And then when we look at those who have core responsibilities as their primary responsibility in their job, we also see that new mothers are significantly less likely to stop engaging in those relative to new fathers. And again, this is net of people's education level and experience and age and industry and all of those things we might think would confound these effects. Okay, so I want to move now to talking about what might be the drivers? What are the catalysts of these patterns? Why do we see this sort of deeply gendered parenthood consequences in STEM? So we want to think about these as both structural catalysts as well as cultural catalysts. And so the structural catalysts might be things that seem a little bit more familiar to you in terms of the drivers of these patterns. So first and foremost are, of course, things like national and state or province level family leave policies. I think Leah will probably talk about this in a little bit more depth than I. This map that I have on the right-hand side is really abysmal, especially for scholars and activists in the United States. And it shows paid maternity leave, and the countries in red are the ones with no paid leave. And the US is sort of a one of four, I think, or one of only 8 countries that has no federal level paid leave for new parents. So we have to think about what the policies are at baseline in terms of what's available to new parents to help support them, and also how gender neutral those are, right? We might have things that are available to only mothers, but that really doesn't help us undermine the gendering of the responsibilities for care work after the child is born. The second important structural factors are things that happen at the organizational level. So this might be at the institutional level in one's university, or if one is working in industry, for example, the corporate organization's policies. So that might be discriminatory organizational policies, that might be about who gets assigned sort of the most prestigious work tasks, but also the way that the work is designed. So a really good example of this is some laboratories where there's chemicals that scientists are dealing with on a regular basis that actually could be harmful to women who are pregnant or breastfeeding, and the lack of ability for the organization to accommodate mothers and women who are in that position in a way that doesn't create a career cul-de-sac for them down the line. And then third are things like local and federal level opportunity structures. So these are structures that might be related to the concretization of part-time opportunities, the ability for people who might have been out of the labor force for a while to take part in educational opportunities or retraining opportunities. Those are structural processes that can be really important in either amplifying the sorts of disadvantages that I talked about or tamping them down. But in addition to these structural factors, we have to think about cultural factors. And people who aren't really familiar thinking about culture as a driver of inequality can often think that cultural beliefs and practices are just a little too thin or flimsy to actually make any kind of impact on the world. But I think maybe over the last year or two, we've seen the power of beliefs to have an impact not only on individuals' lives, but on sort of structural and political sort of opportunity structures. So I want to talk about a couple of the cultural factors that are especially salient for the kinds of processes that I've just talked about. So first and foremost are the competing expectations that mothers in STEM have to deal with. And in particular, we want to think about the competing expectations for work devotion and for family devotion. So let me define what these two are. So the expectations for work devotion can be thought of as this kind of cultural mandate that defines our paid work, our professional work, as deserving of our undivided attention. That to be devoted to work means being an ideal worker who is not distracted by any other life responsibilities, especially childcare responsibilities. So this is a quote from a STEM professional who is in industry and is talking about what her CEO is demanding of the professionals, the kind of work devotion her CEO is demanding of the professionals in her organization. She says, the CEO felt very strongly that if you're really on the team for the company, it had to be like the most important thing in your life, that you were really expected to eat and sleep and dream and work and do everything for it. And he said, no part-time people. So that sense of like, it is your full requirement and devotion to be committed to your work is what we mean by work devotion. And STEM fields in particular have a very amplified expectation for work devotion. But next to that, women are often shouldered with the expectation for family devotion. So this is the sort of morally laden cultural schema that dictates that parents, but especially mothers, give their full attention and devotion to the care and development of their children and limit the outsourcing of that care as much as possible to other people. And this is something that I don't have to probably provide any examples of. It's sort of in the water. It's something that we know culturally. But I actually think the absence of it makes the expectation for family devotion all the clearer among women. So this quote here is from a STEM faculty member that we interviewed. And he's talking about how he puts really firm boundaries for his wife and his daughter between his caregiving responsibility time and his work time. He says, so I am definitely one of those people that are dedicated to the work. My family has learned how to live with this. They are very good about it. My wife and my daughter, the first question my daughter asks him is, are you busy now? Like they know that I can be just sitting, but I'm thinking about what I have to do at work. So the contrast here is between the space that women don't have often to have that be an appropriate way to think and talk about family devotion. So what this this competing expectation can mean is that many times people, particularly men in STEM, but also women without children, will perceive women to not want to do STEM work, that they exclude women from full sort of mentorship and inclusion in conversations about STEM because they think they won't want the sort of intensity of work devotion that STEM requires. So this is actually a woman STEM faculty member. She's a senior professor and she doesn't have children from some research. She said, it is a 60 to 80 hour a week job. So I don't think we should ever expect the ratio of women and men STEM faculty to be at 50-50. I think we should only ever expect to be about 25-75, to be honest with you, because most women prioritize their children at somewhat higher level and don't want a 60 to 80 hour a week job, So I've had a number of female graduate students and postdocs who have chosen, for example, to go to smaller universities where she presumes that they would have greater flexibility for work-life balance. So this is something that's a perception that this faculty member has about her colleagues and her graduate students and her postdocs, and can have consequences for the kinds of career trajectories those colleagues have down the line. The second cultural ideology I want to point to is something called flexibility bias. And flexibility bias exists in the labor force generally, but is especially potent within STEM. And flexibility bias, sort of formally defined, is the negative sanctions for workers who violate the ideal worker norm by either seeking accommodations for personal responsibilities or being presumed to need those accommodations, even if they don't ask for them, because they have childcare responsibilities. And so research has shown that even even professionals who remain working full-time in their professional jobs, those who use work-life policies, maybe some flexible scheduling or something like that, experience lower earnings, lower performance evaluations, and less respect from their colleagues than people who don't utilize those work-life policies. And so what that leads to often is an underutilization of these work-life policies. So we see that a far fewer proportion of people who have access to work-life balance policies in their universities or in their workplaces actually use them because they fear the kind of bias and stigmatization that comes along with flexibility bias. But it's also important to note that flexibility bias increases attrition, meaning that people who sense that there is a flexibility bias in their workplaces are more likely to want to leave those workplaces for other opportunities. And this is not only disruptive for the organizations that are employing these individuals, but it's incredibly expensive. So one of the things in other contexts that we like to talk about in relation to this research is that when you lose STEM faculty, for example, because of things like flexibility bias, it's extraordinarily expensive. So just the startup packages for STEM faculty, as you likely know, range from about $90,000 upwards of $400,000 or even more, depending on what kind of equipment is required for that faculty's research. So we also know that in business organizations outside of academia, that the cost to replace a professional is about 1.5 times the annual salary of that person. So if you have an engineer that works for $100,000 a year, and that engineer ends up leaving because they don't feel supported in balancing their work and family responsibilities, it would cost on average about $150,000 to replace and train somebody new. So here's a couple of examples of flexibility bias sort of in action. So the first quote is from a woman STEM faculty member, and she talks about how she feels the need to kind of hide her family responsibilities from her colleagues. She says, "The less colleagues know about my personal situation, the better, because I think they make judgments. I want to succeed. I like this job, and I will accept that responsibility. I keep my personal life sheltered because it just undermines your professionalism." Although we see flexibility bias as something that is targeted to women more so than men, or mothers more so than fathers, it is not only something that mothers are targets of. So the second quote is from a woman STEM faculty member who's talking about how her husband was treated after the birth of their first child. She says, "My husband took his full family medical leave, 12 weeks, and that was looked at askance. His colleagues thought, 'Men don't take leave. Maybe you take a few days when the kids are born, but it's been a month.' And he responded, 'Well, I'm bonding with my son.' People were less supportive of him, as though the only reason to stay home would be physically recovering from childbirth." So how do we think about addressing these issues in the context of the kinds of structural and cultural factors that I've talked about? So first and foremost, probably sort of tying into the title of my talk today, the primary solution should not be individual level solutions. So there are important movements made to sort of mentoring opportunities and negotiation workshops and leaning in and for women to sort of do the heroic work of amping up to counter any sort of biases they might encounter. But this really just puts the burden on women and mothers and doesn't affect change in the long run. If we're serious about undermining the biases and disadvantages that mother and STEM face, individual level solutions are just a band-aid, and they're not going to solve the problem in the long run. And so we need to think about structural shifts first and foremost. So making sure that to the extent that we can and we can advocate for adequate and gender neutral parental leave policies. So where there are parental leave policies, they're more often given to women than they are to parents of all genders. And that just reinforces the expectation that mothers are going to be the primary caregivers in the household. And I know that there's some countries, Nordic countries in particular, that have gone a long way to make their leave policies more gender neutral. And they still have a long way to go, but we need to move further in that direction than a lot of nations are. Another structural shift is to figure out how to develop ramp up opportunities and skill top up opportunities, especially for mothers or parents who have been out of the labor force for a bit of time or have gone to part-time work for a bit of time. So there's very little opportunities often for new mothers who have gone to part-time work to amp up back into those technical focused full-time STEM jobs. And what's more, as I noted, how expensive it is for businesses to replace STEM professionals who might have left because they couldn't manage the balance of work and family responsibilities. It would likely be much less expensive for companies to invest in these kind of ramp up policies that might be 6 months worth of a professional salary than do a search for somebody new and have to retrain them into the same roles. I think there's also opportunities for these kinds of ramp up and skill top up opportunities at the federal level. So the National Science Foundation, for example, I think is kicking around some ideas about what these sort of ramp up opportunities might look like for people who have been out of their technical STEM field for a while and are looking to get back in. And then finally, regarding these cultural shifts, the first thing that we need to do is name them and demand that they be changed. So we can't fix things that we aren't able to label and see as problems. So first and foremost is combating those work devotion demands. So in our organizations and in our workplaces, being able to name the expectation of this intense work devotion and try to walk it back for the benefit of everyone, not just those who have childcare responsibilities. Second is to name and confront flexibility bias. So we know that there's greater retention when there's lower flexibility bias. So if that bias can be mitigated, that's an important thing for retention and the persistence, particularly of mothers in STEM. And then finally, thinking really hard about our definitions of competence and excellence in STEM. One of the things we found in our research is that in STEM in particular, notions of competence and excellence are deeply interwoven with the idea of working 60 or 80 hours a week without any other responsibilities or expectations or demands on one's time. The way that we assess excellence and competence needs to be removed from the expectation for that intense work, devotion, and demand. With that, I will leave it to the next speaker and look forward to the Q&A at the end.